Welcome everyone in person and on Zoom. We're happy to have you here for this tonight's installment of the Earth Talks series. Before I forget, for questions, but before I introduce our speaker, if anyone has questions on Zoom, please raise your Zoom hand or put your questions in the chat on Zoom, and Seth, who is here moderating Zoom, will take your questions. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Alex Klass, who is the James G. Degnan Professor of Law at Michigan Law. She also co-directs Michigan's Environment and Energy program. All of these programs have slightly different names. And recently, from 2022 to 2023, Professor Klass was Deputy General Counsel for Energy Efficiency and Clean Energy Demonstrations at the U.S. Department of Energy. So she comes very recently from Washington, D.C., from that government perspective on energy. And because it's election eve, I'll just quickly mention, before that, she was a professor of law at the University of Minnesota Law School, and she was on the Advisory Council on Climate Change under Governor Tim Walz. Just had to bring that one in for election eve. So we are incredibly excited to have Alex here. I've known Alex since I was on the entry-level market. She's been an incredible mentor to me. So it's really exciting that we finally got her to Penn State. Thank you, Alex, for being here.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Seth, for inviting me. Yeah, this is my first time at Penn State. It's been great. Got to see some old friends and see around the campus a little bit and see Hannah's chickens and outdoor goldfish, which are goldfish pond, which was very exciting as well. So I'm excited to talk to you about this project that we call Repurposed Energy. And it's based on a paper that Hannah and I wrote together. So it's fun for me to present it here since she's here. And I'm going to invite her after my remarks to maybe make a few observations and comments as well. And so this paper is coming out in the Minnesota Law Review in the next few weeks. I mean, we're literally doing the last edits with the editors like as we speak today. So that's exciting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of start with a history of sort of where we are in terms of our energy transition, just to set the stage. I recognize we have some students. We maybe have some people who are experts in this already, but I think I'll sort of start a little bit basic and then get into our thesis in the paper, which is that kind of our concept of using repurposed energy can be a way to kind of accelerate our clean energy transition in a way that works for the climate, that works for communities, and that really focuses on both rural communities and urban communities. So with that, I want to do a background on kind of our current energy landscape so you can see where we are coming from. So I've always liked this diagram because it kind of gives you a history of the United States, starting back in 1776 through the energy resources that we have used throughout this time. And this is looking at all energy consumption. So that means both electricity and transportation. So, you see that our first source of energy that we used for just about everything was renewables. It was wood that we burned for all sorts of things. And then, of course, in the mid-1800s, we have the Industrial Revolution, and coal comes on the scene. That's the black line over here. Let's see. I think if I have a pointer, I might as well use it. And so you see a big increase in coal. Then, of course, we've had petroleum for a long time, but we really have an increase right when we start driving cars, right? Which is because petroleum is really what we use in our transportation sector, and that's been true for a long time. Blue is natural gas. Natural gas had been available locally in places like Pennsylvania, but we didn't have a good way to transport it around the country like we did with petroleum and oil, which you can put in barrels, in trucks, and you transport it lots of different ways. Natural gas, you need pipelines. So we figured out in the early 1900s how to build natural gas pipelines, and then natural gas became a more national energy use. Then we have the nuclear age, that's in red, after World War II. And then we see, of course, big changes right around 2007 in terms of big increase in natural gas, big decrease in coal. And that, as many of you in Pennsylvania here know, is because of fracking. All of a sudden, we had lots more domestic natural gas. The cost of natural gas went down, and so then it was not. So then it was able to be a baseload fuel to generate electricity and really displace coal in that regard. Around the same time, we see a modest increase in renewables, not wood this time, but wind, and then increasingly solar. So before, we basically had wood and hydropower, and this is also including corn-based ethanol, because again, this is looking at both electricity and transportation. This diagram goes from 1950 to the present, and it's basically the same data, just put in a different format. And of course, in all of these, you see this big drop in kind of all energy resources in 2020. And that, of course, is because of the pandemic, when we weren't driving cars and we weren't running factories and we weren't using as much energy. The earlier ones tend to coincide with recessionary periods in the US. Once again, another depiction of this, the same data, but just in a way that is a little bit prettier. And this also breaks down our fossil fuel share and non-fossil fuel share. And you see, really, predominantly, we still use fossil fuels in our energy system, almost 80% in 2022. Even though we have had an increase in carbon-free energy, it's still pretty modest. And then this, this one gives it as a percentage, which is also helpful to look at. So you see wood being used for everything, then of course not so much, and then you see our other sources of energy, again, used on a percentage basis. And then this is just a snapshot of time for 2023, and shows you the breakdown of petroleum, natural gas, nuclear, coal, and then an even a better breakdown of renewable energy. Biofuels used in the transportation sector, basically corn-based ethanol, and then the rest of it really used in the electricity sector. And you see, on the electricity side, wind is now the biggest. Okay, so now we move to electricity. So that means petroleum essentially drops out. So we're looking at only energy used to generate electricity, not the energy used in our transportation sector. And so basically, you only use petroleum to generate electricity if you have no other alternatives. It's very expensive, and it also has a lot of emissions as well. So basically, you use it in Hawaii and Alaska and places that you don't have a lot of other options. It's very expensive. So you see, for most of our history, coal has been what we have used to generate electricity, again, until natural gas displaced it. And now you see they sort of have an interesting convergence right around, this is 2020, where you have about, in the electricity sector, coal, nuclear, and renewables about the same. Renewables has now gone up, coal's gone down a little bit. Nuclear, we haven't built a lot of new nuclear plants, so nuclear stays steady. Another diagram that just shows the same data in a different way. This one's looking only at electricity generation from renewable energy sources, 1950 to 2023. And you see that, for a long time, hydropower was our largest source of renewable electricity. That's been overtaken by wind. And you see this, the increasing use of solar as well. Geothermal is still quite small. This looks at it by percentages in terms of how the percentages of energy resources for our electric power sector have changed since 1990. Again, decrease in coal, increase in natural gas, nuclear pretty flat, and then solar and wind increasing, and then other renewables, mostly hydropower, again, slightly declining on a percentage-wise basis. And then this is just doing the breakdown of zero carbon generation. So we've got nuclear, wind and solar, hydro, and then our other renewables. So you see wind and solar on the rise, slow rise, but not the sort of dramatic increase that, let's say, we saw for natural gas after fracking began. And then here's our snapshot in time. Again, just for electricity. So we now have natural gas as our biggest energy source for electricity in the US. Coal is smaller, nuclear and coal, similar. Renewables, if you put them all together, larger, but still it's only 21%. Okay, So we have a lot of federal and state clean energy goals that are designed to accelerate that trend towards a decarbonized electricity system and also just a decarbonized energy system. So let's look at what those are. First, we have some federal goals from the Biden administration. One is an emissions-based goal, so reducing U.S. emissions 50% from our levels in 2005 by 2030. The second one is 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. And we'll come back to that goal a little bit later and look at some scenarios under which we could meet that goal. So of course, by having it be a carbon-free goal rather than a renewable goal, that means we can include nuclear. And it also means eventually we could include like natural gas plus carbon capture sequestration. So it's focusing not on whether the resource is renewable or not, but whether it is carbon free. There's a goal of net zero emissions across the whole economy by 2050. So then that would also bring in transportation and the building sector as well, so decarbonizing buildings. A goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That's going to be a tall order since we are still very new at doing offshore wind in this country, even though in Europe, of course, it's a very well-established technology, has allowed England to close its last coal plant just recently because of the offshore wind. And then the federal government has a lot of control over what happens on federal public lands, particularly in the West, because the federal government owns a lot of land. And so there's a goal of 25 gigawatts of wind, solar, and geothermal energy permitted on public lands by 2025. And that's also a congressional goal as well. And we actually met that this year. So there now has been 25 gigawatts of these forms of renewable energy on public lands. Yes, question?
My question is about the 100% carbon-free electricity goal, whether that includes offsetting, and could, say, the U.S. purchase offsets from other countries to reach that goal, given the verbiage that's being used?
Yeah, I don't think the U.S., it's set up for like the U.S. as a country to purchase offsets from anywhere else. I mean, this is going to be like generated in the United States, but that doesn't mean that like electric utilities can't like meet their carbon-free goals through offsets. So, I mean, I think in terms of the parties that are like reporting their emissions, they can do that, but the U.S. as a country, no. I see Hannah nodding. Is that right? Okay, and the ultimate goal here, of course, is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That is the goal in the Paris Agreement. These days, we are not on track to do that, so we need to be doing a lot more. So as I said, some of, this 25 gigawatts on public land, we have met that, so that's good. The other ones are a tall order. It's not impossible, but we have to do a lot more than we're doing right now. Now, the Biden administration is not, and the federal government is not the only governmental entity that has clean energy and decarbonization goals. There are lots and lots of them in the states, and a lot of the states have accelerated those. So if you haven't seen this map before, it's a little bit busy. So the blue is basically what we call renewable portfolio standards or renewable energy standards. So these are state mandates on electric utilities in the state that they have to provide their customers with a certain percentage of renewable electricity by a certain date. And the percentage sort of goes up by date. So it's only for renewable energy. At the time, a lot of these were passed in the 1990s. Basically, wind was what they were focused on because basically the cost of solar hadn't gone down to the levels it had now. And so just solar wasn't really on the scene. You kind of saw that from the earlier slides, that solar is much more recent. So you have, some like modest goals, like Iowa was one of the first renewable portfolio standards. So we're going to get to 105 megawatts. Soon I will show you like how much wind energy there is online in Iowa, and it is a lot more than 105 megawatts. Texas also had a very modest renewable portfolio standard. So lots of states, both politically conservative states and more progressive states, passed these renewable portfolio standards, mix of folks worried about, just wanting more renewable electricity. Also, rural economic development. Like that was definitely how the law got passed in Minnesota. You have a coalition of environmental groups, people who, you have a lot of wind in Minnesota. And so this is really good money for farmers. This was true in Texas as well. And there are researchers who have done studies of sort of the coalitions that were built on passing these laws. But they were all focused on renewable energy, definitely did not include nuclear, and for the most part did not include like existing hydropower as well. So the idea was to spur new development of new energy industries in the state. The ones that are in light blue are the ones that had like a goal. Like it wasn't really a mandate, like try really hard, but it isn't a mandate. Not surprising that you didn't see any of them in the southeast, since this was very much focused on wind, and I'll show you on maps later, there basically is not a lot of wind in the southeast. So that was not a resource that was available, although you do see like a few states that have some modest ones. Okay, the ones in green are newer. So more recently, I would say in the last 10 years and even last 5 years, a lot of states are focusing on, hey, we want to get to 100%, and we want to get to 100% carbon free. We care more about the carbon emissions. Renewables are part of that, but we can get to 100% if we include existing nuclear, or maybe new nuclear, or perhaps natural gas with CCS if that develops. And so you see an increasing number of states that now have both a renewable portfolio standard and a clean energy standard. So like I'll use my old state of Minnesota, they revised their law to be more aggressive last year. And so now they want 55% renewable energy by 2035. And they're already at a pretty high level because there's a lot of wind and now a lot of solar in Minnesota, but then 100% carbon free by 2040. And they can use their existing nuclear plus other new technologies that might develop. Michigan, my other state in the Midwest that I live in, had a very, very modest goal until last year, and then they upped it to 60% renewables by 2030 for Michigan, which is starting out at a much lower level of renewable energy. That is going to be a tall order. So 60% by 2030, and yet again, 100% carbon-free by 2040. So you see a lot of states here that kind of have both, and so that's what you see in the green. Hawaii decided to go 100% renewable electricity by 2045. They don't really have other carbon-free resources. They're not building nuclear plants on Hawaii, and they also don't have coal. They basically use oil, which is, again, not a good thing to do. So they're really investing in wind and solar. So that's how you read this map. And of course, the smaller states on the East Coast, there's not enough room to put them in the state like you can in California or Minnesota. So those are all off to the right. And a lot of these have been updated just in the last few years. Okay, so how close are we to getting to these goals? Let's look at some of the trends. So let's start with wind. As I said, not all of the US is very conducive to generating wind energy. So the windy parts of the US are the purple, the red, and the orange areas. That's where you have a lot of good wind resources. It's basically right through the center of the country. Unfortunately, that is not where we have a lot of our population centers, right? Too windy, nobody wants to live there. That's not totally true. But you see like the southeast, just not good for wind, right? So this is where we want to build our wind, is in the purple, the red, and the orange areas. As we build bigger wind towers, there's different areas of the country where you could do more wind, but this is a lot of what we're focused on today, is using what can we do with current technology. Also areas in the west are pretty good as well. Here's where we have wind energy capacity actually installed. This is as of Q1 2023. So it's 145,000 megawatts total. You see that Texas is the big leader in wind. It is not because they have a renewable portfolio standard or a clean energy standard. It's not because they have lots of policies on climate change. It's good business to build anything in Texas, and you can build anything, essentially anything where you want in Texas. So it is very conducive to building wind, solar, every kind of energy, and any kind of development. So you see how there's such a huge leader there. Remember how I said Iowa had 105 megawatts as their goal? There's 13,000 megawatts of wind in Iowa right now. So they're also one of the top states. But you also see Oklahoma, Kansas. Not all the states in that wind band have really invested in wind in the same way. Like South Dakota and North Dakota are definitely underperforming. But there are good reasons why it's zero in those southeastern states, because they just don't really have the wind resource. This map's kind of fun because it shows like what those states actually could do. So this is not what is installed, but this is like the potential wind capacity. And you see how much more we could be building in a lot of these central plain states and Texas, but even, quite a bit in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and around and some of the states further east as well. Okay, so now we're going to move to solar. Solar is not as geographically constrained as wind. There's so many. Wind works kind of in large utility scale projects for the most part. You don't see a lot of like small scale wind around. Solar you can have on rooftops, you can have on parking lots, you can have in open fields. You can also, oh, I don't have that. Also, I was going to show one of the big sort of concentrating solar power plants. I mean, really, really large facilities in the desert Southwest and just in any open space. But you can have solar anywhere. So some of the really large intensive facilities, yes, you want those in the western part of the US, but you can build solar anywhere in the country. So it's much more versatile in that way. And we've seen a real increase in solar even just since 2014. And that as prices go down and as the technology improves, we're going to see that increase. And I think no one really anticipated that the cost and the technology would develop as quickly as it has. And so this is also showing you the differences between the utility scale, larger projects, and the smaller scale, like rooftop solar, which we often refer to as distributed solar. This gives it, shows it on a cumulative basis since 2010. And again, breaking it down by utility scale solar, the concentrating solar projects that are really in the desert Southwest, residential, commercial, and then community solar, which really only exists in states that have policies to develop community solar. So Minnesota is a state like that, Massachusetts is as well. This is looking at sort of where we have, at least as of 2022, sort of all state installed solar capacity. And you see California is the leader, although this is 2022. I think either this year or next year, Texas, I think, is going to overtake California because they're building so much there. Florida and North Carolina are kind of new entries on the map. You wouldn't think that they were new entries because they're pretty sunny places, but the policy had sort of not, to develop solar had really not caught up until the last 5 years or so. But you see that, you really can build solar just about anywhere. There could be a lot of solar in some of these plain states here. They just don't have the policies or the laws to do that, but they certainly could. This is looking at sort of at distributed solar, so more like small scale rooftop solar relating to the state population. So it's taking state population into account. And so that's where you see kind of policies to promote solar really making a difference. So California has had very forward-looking solar policies for a long time. So you see a lot of solar in California. That's why you also see like Massachusetts. How is there more solar in Massachusetts? There isn't in terms of the amount of megawatts, but in terms of taking into account population, it's very high because once again, Massachusetts has a lot of policies to promote solar. That's also why you see Minnesota pretty high on the map as well. Part of their renewable portfolio standard for a long time has had a special carve out for solar to make the utilities invest in solar. And they also have community solar because I'm sure you wouldn't think of Minnesota as like a hotbed of solar development, although it is very sunny there. This is doing the same kind of analysis, but looking at just community solar. And basically you have community solar where residents can subscribe to sort of medium scale solar projects nearby. You need special state policy to do that. So Minnesota and Massachusetts and New York have had those policies for the longest, and so you see the most community scale solar there. So this means if you can't put solar on your own rooftop, you can subscribe to a project somewhere else, which is a nice option for people who are renting or just don't have a good roof for solar like me. And then this puts kind of all of these together and shows our increase in sort of clean energy, focusing particularly on renewable energy capacity over time since 2000. And this shows you the trend of, wind was really our big renewable energy resource in this country until recently. Now you see it's more solar that is being built. Green is energy storage, so all of the increase in battery storage that really helps reduce the variability of wind and solar energy, because of course you can't just turn it on and off with a switch, because you only have the solar energy when it's sunny, you only have the wind energy when it's windy. But if you pair that with energy storage, then you can be providing close to round-the-clock power. Offshore wind, we still don't see here, even though we've got a couple turbines going off the coast of Massachusetts. Hopefully that will be on the screen soon. Okay, so the question, so you see pretty good upward trajectory, but that's not going to get us to those federal goals or the state goals if we just keep with the trajectory that we have. We need to build a lot more. So your question is, okay, well, how much do we need? The National Renewable Energy Lab has done a study recently in terms of how do we get to this 100% clean electricity by 2035. Remember, that was one of the federal goals. And we also have lots of states that have similar mandates with regard to that. So NREL estimates that we basically need to do what we're doing times 4. So 4 times the amount of wind and solar. So that means 946 gigawatts, or 946,000 megawatts of new solar in addition to what we have. A little bit more than that with regard to wind. Continuing growth of battery technology, basically getting the cost down and improving the technology of energy storage, and then triple the electric transmission line capacity that we have now, because we've got all this wind energy in areas where we don't have the people to use it, right? We need electric transmission lines to bring those to population centers on the east and the west. So we don't need any new technologies. And we actually don't even need like the cost to come down much. We can use exactly what we have, but we need to build lots more of it. Now you're saying, how much land is that going to take, right? Because you need a lot more land to generate the same amount of energy from wind or solar as you do from, let's say, a nuclear plant. It's not as energy dense, right? So if you only look at direct impacts, and I will explain what a direct impact is, it's actually not that much. 0.44% of the total US land areas. If we include indirect impacts, it's more, almost 6% of total US land area. Now, what does that mean? So basically, with regard to solar, it doesn't mean anything in the sense that, like, once you put down solar panels, other than like sheep grazing and some other things on that footprint, you're basically using it all for solar. But think about a wind farm, right? You've got towers for the wind turbines, and in between those towers, you can farm, you can ranch, you can have houses, you can do whatever you would want to do there before. Usually you're doing farming or ranching. So if you're only looking at the direct impacts of a wind farm, you're looking at the footprint of the turbines, and you're not including in between the towers, because you can still do stuff with the land. If you decide you're going to look at indirect impacts, so you say you have a big wind farm, we're going to assume that basically the whole thing is not usable, then that's higher. And I'll show you a map so that you can see what that looks like. So this is kind of a fun map that NREL puts in its report. And first it shows you like how much land we use for other stuff. So, and this is like not in these particular areas, but just shows the amount of land. So this is like the amount of land we use for livestock grazing and feed. It's a lot, right? Here's what we use this is the amount of land we use just to grow ethanol, corn ethanol, to like put in our gasoline and in our cars. Here's what we use for roads, building footprints, railroads, golf courses, airports, urban areas, oil and gas leases on federal lands. Okay, so now we can compare that to wind and solar and transmission. So here's where you see this direct versus indirect. If we're just looking at the direct impact of wind, it's basically this little box, right? If we use the indirect, it's a much bigger box, right? Solar's basically the same. And the different colors they had different scenarios. Like, what if we can build a lot of transmission? What if we can't? What if we can use carbon capture sequestration? What if we can't? What if, because we're trying to figure out, make predictions about what's going to happen in the next, 20 years. So I think this map is really helpful because it shows we actually don't need that much land, even if we're going to triple or quadruple the amount of wind and solar energy that we have in this country and build out the transmission lines. Here's the footprint comparison under their different scenarios and what we would need for wind, for solar. There's offshore wind there, and then transmission. And so here's just a kind of a summary of the analyses that they did. So they looked at, 4 different scenarios to get to 100% clean electricity. And they looked at that in terms of, well, what's it going to cost and what are the benefits in terms of health benefits, environmental benefits, those sorts of things. And all the scenarios resulted in the benefits exceeding the costs. They also said it is much easier to get to 90% than 100%. Like basically, we can pretty easily get to 90%. And since, as I showed you before, we are nowhere near 90%, at this point in time, 90% sounds pretty good, right? My attitude is let's figure out that 10% later when we get closer to the 90% rather than argue about should our goal be 90% or 100%. Not everyone would agree with me, but that's sort of my pragmatic view on these things. But the conclusion of the report, I think, is quite optimistic, that basically technologies that are being deployed widely now, we don't need to invent anything new, can provide most of our US electricity by 2035 in a very decarbonized way. So this is low cost, and this is relying primarily on new wind, solar, and storage. So this doesn't require us to build a lot of new nuclear plants. We might do that, and then we don't need as much wind and solar. But this is, not assuming that we're going to continue on our not building a lot of new nuclear in the U.S., which has been kind of what we've been doing the last few decades. And then this just sort of shows the net benefits under these different scenarios. I'm not going to go through these in detail. The report is very public, but I think it's a nice way to look at kind of what these scenarios are and what we can actually do. And then here's just a summary slide that's actually right from the report. Okay, so why aren't we doing this, right? This is easy. We can do this. We have some barriers to building these new wind and solar projects that are not based on cost and are not based on technology. Hannah and I in the paper lay out some of these. One is we've got to find enough land to build the renewable energy. We have it, but it's not like you use eminent domain and the government comes in and says, we are taking your land for a wind farm or a solar farm. You need appropriate land and you need a willing landowner who wants to do that. Oftentimes you will actually all the time, you have a willing landowner or landowners for these projects, but you often have neighbors that are not happy about the projects. And so oftentimes you have siting barriers, permitting barriers to new wind and solar plants and transmission lines, some of which have been in existence, others which come up once a project is proposed. There's a lot of community opposition to change, particularly change involving land. And so a lot of that has been directed to new wind and solar projects, and that is particularly true as renewable energy in the last few years has become much more politicized than it was in the past. As I said, when these first renewable portfolio standards were passed, this wasn't political at all. This was like rural economic development. But now renewable energy is often paired with climate change, which is political, and so that politicizes renewable energy projects as well in a way that's not helpful. Sometimes there's difficulty with funding and incentives and financing to build these projects. And there's also concerns about environmental justice and energy justice concerns. Are we putting new energy infrastructure in communities that have already borne kind of the brunt of our fossil fuel energy infrastructure? And do we want to take that into account? So these are all different challenges that we have to building the wind and solar we need for this 100% decarbonized electricity system. So in the paper, we sort of categorize these barriers. Some of these are what we call political economic barriers, right? There's concern about opposition, there's politics, there's distrust of the benefits. How are we, the community that's going to host this project, going to benefit? Is it going to change our way of life? These bigger projects are going to be in rural areas. That's where we have land. Concerned about aesthetics, and these are legitimate concerns. We have some governance challenges. Typically, wind and solar projects, the permitting authority is a local government. Not always, and I'll talk about how that's changed over time. But like in Michigan, up until last year, it was not the state that gave approval for wind and solar projects, and it wasn't even the county. It was townships. There's a lot of townships in Michigan, so it was very, very local. Regardless of who is doing the siting authority or issuing the permit, oftentimes it's a very burdensome process, right? There's too many veto points, there's too many hurdles to overcome, and that makes the project more expensive and can also make the project fall apart. And then, of course, there's these environmental and energy justice concerns that I raised before. So these are just a few headlines that you probably have seen in the paper as well, as a project developer working with landowners trying to get a project through approval. Lots of benefits for communities in terms of tax revenues, sometimes jobs, sometimes, so in terms of the landowners, lots of revenues. Oftentimes this allows people to keep farms in their family because now they have another revenue source other than growing crops, and they're still growing crops on other parts of the farm. So you have the landowners that want the projects, but oftentimes their neighbors don't. And then their neighbors vote for a new slate of city council people or county commissioners, and then all of a sudden there is a moratorium on wind projects in general, on solar projects in general. So you see a lot of community conflicts over this. So this is where we get to a potential solution that is not a solution to all of our renewable energy building woes, but Hannah and I think can be a good solution to sort of help move us on a trajectory towards more renewable energy that works for communities. And that is what we call repurposed energy. So it's thinking about where are we placing these projects. There are a lot of areas that we would consider already disturbed. They're already disturbed by some other type of energy infrastructure, or there are land that's contaminated in some way, and these would be very good locations for new wind and solar projects. Closed and abandoned coal mines, very important here in Pennsylvania. Closing and closed coal plants, very important in many parts of the country. Closed landfills, underutilized industrial properties, other types of what we call brownfields, just contaminated or underused properties. Those are both in rural areas and urban areas. Lands that are previously used for oil and gas development, and marginal farmland. We have a lot of lands like this in the US. And this is already starting to happen. So Minnesota, where I lived for a long time, Xcel Energy, that's the dominant utility there, it has its Sherco coal facility, which is the largest carbon emitter in the state. It's a massive 1,200 megawatt coal facility. They are retiring that facility and have already taken the first 2 units down, and they're actually building 800 megawatts of solar, which is a lot of solar, on that site in adjacent marginal farmland. This is just outside the Twin Cities, and pairing it with new long-term battery storage that they have that the battery company has a grant from the Department of Energy to work on. It can potentially store energy for 100 hours if it can be done at scale. You see a lot more projects on landfills. And Amazon is doing some of its first brownfield renewable energy projects. This one is on an abandoned coal mine. The nice thing about these projects is you already have a lot of the electric transmission and transportation infrastructure built in, right? So you're not starting from scratch there. Here's some farmland ones. These involve solar. You see sheep. Sheep and solar panels work well together. And so people can bring sheep back onto their farms. And then here's one that's a wind project on a former steel plant in Buffalo, New York. So you can do it with wind as well, but really solar is probably the best application here. And here's some solar projects on landfills in Georgia and a couple in New Jersey. Cows go well with wind, and sheep. Okay, so this is why we think repurposed energy, there's many reasons why we think repurposed energy projects are a good idea. There's a lot of them in the US. There was one estimate that said about 11% of total U.S. contiguous land is some of these marginal lands. They also include like highway right-of-ways and some other things that we don't include, but there's a strong overlap with repurposed energy sites. There's more and more mapping going on, so we actually know where these sites are and then can make them available to developers and encourage developers to use them. It keeps us away from what we call greenfields, right? So sensitive environmental areas, prime farmland, those sorts of things. It allows development in urban and rural areas. There's often concern by rural communities is why do we have to host all the renewable energy, particularly when a lot of that electricity is going to urban areas. But there's a lot of brownfields properties in and around urban areas, and so those can be used as well. And then, as I mentioned before, a lot of these facilities have really good access to transmission lines, transmission interconnections, and roads, so there's a benefit as well. Why are these good for communities? There's a lot of money involved flowing to communities. You've got taxes and lease payments. Sometimes you can provide electricity directly to communities. Energy bill credits, New York actually requires that. And then you can also require community of benefits agreements. So Michigan now requires for certain types of projects, $2,000 per megawatt of capacity goes in a community benefits agreement and goes to support, fire and police and schools and those sorts of things. In terms of, there's also cleanup benefits. You're going to clean up contaminated properties that are just laying idle and really reuse underutilized properties to produce energy, which is a good thing. So in the paper, we have some policy tools. We talk about funding. We talk about preemption, where, in terms of maybe states taking over some of the siting and permitting authority for local governments. We talk about permitting and other types of reforms, just so we have more uniform standards and kind of speed up the process. And then also informational support in terms of mapping energy resources and repurposed energy sites, and just helping both developers and communities navigate their way through the process. How are we on time? Should I speed up or not? We're good? Okay. Okay. So then I'll spend a little time going into details on each of these categories. So we're going to start with funding. So like Hannah and I are not the first people to think that like this is a good idea and maybe it should be funded. So there's a lot of money in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. These are the two new big, industrialization, sort of national policies for both clean energy and infrastructure development in the U.S. IIJA was in 2021, Inflation Reduction Act 2022. So one of them is the DOE's Energy Infrastructure and Reinvestment program. So this is a loan program, $250 billion in funding for remediation, repurposing, and redevelopment to replace retiring or retired energy infrastructure with clean energy infrastructure, and also funding cleanup costs. So that was in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then there's a whole bunch of grant programs that were in the IIJA. When I was at Department of Energy, part of what I was working with the legal team on was kind of creating and developing those grant programs to making sure that they're consistent with the congressional authorization. And there's lots of B's in this. There's a lot of billions of dollars floating around. So grants for energy improvements in rural and remote areas. So for really small communities to be able to invest in clean energy. There's a separate program, $500 million for clean energy on former mine lands. So directly to use former mining areas for clean energy development. There's a tax credit bonus. So one of the things that the Inflation Reduction Act did was take our existing federal tax credits for wind and solar, which tend to, they're enacted and then they're about to expire and then they come back up. Now we have a long-term 10-year clean energy tax credit, and there's a bonus. So there's basically a 10% bonus if you put the clean energy project in what they call an energy community. So what's an energy community? Congress defines it as an area that is home to a closed coal plant, home to a closed or closing coal mine, brownfield sites, which we've already talked about, or just areas that have a lot of employment tied to fossil fuel. So the idea is to incentivize developers to do those projects in areas, most of which have repurposed energy sites. There's $27 billion in an EPA greenhouse gas reduction grant program. So this goes to states and tribes and cities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including a big pot of money for solar development. And then the USDA has a big program, $10 billion for rural electric cooperatives, which are often have been very coal heavy in the past, for them to move to renewable energy and also do energy efficiency programs. So there's a lot of federal money going to these types of projects, and so our ideas kind of build on these. Lots of states also have what we call brownfield programs. This was after these were enacted after the Superfund, the federal Superfund law in 1980, to try to get contaminated properties redeveloped and make it easier for that land to just not lay idle because nobody wants to touch it because they're worried about liability. When I was in private practice, I used to do a lot of brownfields redevelopment work as well as Superfund litigation. And so some states like Minnesota actually have staff in the Minnesota pollution control agencies that help with those development. They'll give comfort letters to developers so they can get loans from banks. They can say for like a new owner who comes in, we promise not to sue you because because you didn't contribute to the contamination and you're doing a cleanup and you're cleaning it up to a particular level. I don't know if Pennsylvania has a program like this, but there's funding, there's technical support, and these kind of liability protection letters. One of the things that we suggest in the paper is these existing brownfields programs, it'd be great if they had units to target clean energy development on brownfields. So lots of brownfields might be, brownfield might be turned into a park or a shopping center or a stadium. Sometimes it could be housing. But if we really want to focus in on clean energy development on brownfields, which is a good use of them, right? Because you're not as worried about kids playing on a contaminated property because you've still got contaminated soil there, contaminated groundwater. A solar facility is a very good use of brownfields properties. And so to really sort of direct a lot of development, clean energy development there. And some states are already trying to do that. So states have gotten involved in this as well. And then another thing we talk about in the paper is basically permitting reform and siting reform. And some of that involves preemption, which is just a legal term for displacement. So if the federal government preempts the states, it means the federal government says, states, you're not in charge anymore, and saying yes or no, we, the federal government, are doing this. On clean energy generation projects, the federal government, unless it's projects on federal lands, they're not involved. The question is state authority versus local authority. And so there's a lot of states that for a long time have had statewide siting authority for renewable energy projects, at least larger ones. So Minnesota falls into that category. For larger wind and solar projects, you go to the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, you get a certificate of need, and it's the state that says whether you can build it and under what conditions. Local governments can come in and say they oppose it or they support it, but they don't have a veto. They don't have the final say. Up until recently, that had not been the majority state approach. As I said, Michigan, it had always been townships. What is it in Pennsylvania? Townships as well. Okay, so very much, I've noticed moving from Minnesota to Michigan, in all things, very much more focused in on local control, whereas Minnesota is very much more statewide control, which has just been interesting since they're both Midwestern states that start with M, but the politics are very different. Now, I mean, the politics are not that different, but the local state piece is very different, which has been interesting. But some states, I list here Michigan, California, New York, Maryland, Illinois. What are one thing that those states have in common? If we go back to the map where I showed which states have clean energy, renewable portfolio standards and clean energy standards, they all have strong ones. And some of them are new. And they've looked at those and they've realized if we keep local control for wind and solar plants, if we keep it at the local level, we will never hit our targets. So we need to do something. And that something is state preemption for certain types of projects. So all of these states in the last really 3 years have created more statewide siting authority, at least for larger projects. They say smaller projects can stay at the local level. Bigger projects those have a statewide impact, and we need it to meet our state targets, and therefore we're going to put a state agency in charge of that. And each state does it in a slightly different way. And so this is to get past the sort of local opposition to these projects. But obviously local governments don't like that. Nobody likes it when their power is taken away from them. When power is taken away from them. So there's been a lot of backlash to this as well. So one of the proposals we make is, well, for states that don't have statewide siting authority and where doing that is just not politically feasible, maybe you have statewide siting authority only for repurposed energy projects. So you do it as a pilot project and see how that goes. And also the idea is that those projects might tend to be less controversial. Putting wind or solar on an old landfill or on an old or on a closing coal plant site that's going to close anyway is going to face less resistance from the community than on prime farmland, which makes sense. Another proposal that we have is just streamlining permitting generally for repurposed energy, creating time limits, creating statewide standards. Florida actually has a law that now says solar projects are a permitted use in all agricultural areas. You don't need a special permit, basically. So there are ways to sort of speed this up. New York and Massachusetts are offering what they call build-ready sites. So basically the state gets the site ready for you, there's cleanup, they'll do it, and then they might hold an auction and say which developers want this. Because a lot of developers, they would rather build on green fields because it's easier. The land is already flat. They don't have to worry about contamination. And so this is efforts by states to sort of put the contaminated sites in that category. There's been a proposal that you have automatic permitting for clean energy projects on federal lands if it's already been permitted for oil and gas development, which I actually think is a great idea. It's already disturbed land. Why should you need another type of permit for like a geothermal project or a wind or a solar project? And so, why not speed it up that way? And local governments can do this as well, and some have. So this is something that can happen at the local government, the state, the local level, state, or federal. Information support is really helpful. The Department of Energy is sort of mapping sort of the best lands for clean energy development. I know Hannah's been working with groups here in terms of mapping, like coal mine sites and other sites for renewable energy, figuring out where are these abandoned mine lands, giving this information to energy developers. So lots of stuff going on in the states. There's a way to promote environmental and energy justice, working with communities to identify what lands does the community think would be best served by having renewable energy development there. There's a lot of targeting of this federal funding for projects in disadvantaged communities and on brownfields. And then there's also the state and local requirements I talked about earlier that really that say, okay, if there's going to be a wind project or a solar project here, we want the community to benefit directly from that new energy resource. They're not necessarily going to get those electrons because that's going to go flowing through the transmission line, but maybe there's direct energy bill assistance that the developer has to give the community. So there's a feeling that they're getting some energy related benefits from this as well. And then really the last point that we make in the paper is really focusing on changing the narrative around clean energy development and using repurposed energy as a part of that. So I actually think the renewable energy industry and renewable energy supporters have not done a very good job of creating community and cultural support and pride for these projects. Think about the coal industry and the oil and gas industry for decades in terms of the museums and the learning centers and sort of all of the community support that they deliberately built up for the industry to make people proud of the work that they were doing in that field. And it's been very, very successful, and what has created sort of a culture then that supports those industries. There's no reason the renewable energy industry can't do the same thing. They could create museums and learning centers, tours of projects, letting people go up in wind turbines, having people like work on the motors. And I think there's a lot more that could be done then. I remember I grew up in Chicago, and we lived on the south side of Chicago, and we go to the Museum of Science and Industry. And at the time, I remember when I was a little kid, my favorite exhibit, this was in the early 1970s, was called the Petrochemical Family, that I'm sure Standard Oil paid for. And it had all these little dancing figures of all having to do with petroleum products and the great things and it had a catchy tune and so that was just a part of the culture. And I think we have not done that with renewable energy. And I think there's really an opportunity to do that. And I think we can also really focus in on narratives specifically for repurposed energy projects as well, sort of showing the beneficial change that these projects can bring, particularly with regard to the reduction of fossil fuel and contamination related harms that really exist in so many communities across the country. So I think this is the last slide. We sort of put all these together in terms of our recommendations for kind of a comprehensive repurposed energy approach. Some of these are regulatory and permitting that I talked about. Some of these are communications related. And really the last and most important is making sure that these projects benefit communities in terms of financial support and really helping communities benefit for these types of clean energy projects. So with that, I kind of want to turn it over to Hannah and since this is her paper too, and see if she has some comments as well. And then I guess we'll do questions.
Alex managed to cover almost everything in a 110-page paper. I'll just highlight a couple of themes. I hope you saw overall from the talk that Alex mentioned the many B's in the federal statutes from 2021 and 2022. Billions of dollars flowing to clean energy. And the impediment here is primarily the land use. That's what's stopping these billions of dollars from flowing quickly to the projects that need to be built. And so where do we find that land use solution? We think this is one of the big ones because the local opposition to this particular land use is largely what is stopping the billions of dollars. And preemption is not politically feasible in many cases, for just preempting local governments and saying, deal with it. And it may not even be desirable in many cases because local governments for a very long time have addressed land use for a reason. They are close to the issue. They are more familiar with the concerns of their residents. There's this very long tradition that's hard to overnight just upend. And we view repurposed energy as a potential solution to that land use challenge because given the dynamics in local government settings, this might be a much more palatable solution. So just wanted to highlight again that to get these billions spent and to get to these goals, we really need a solution. Why though haven't developers, if this is a great idea, why haven't developers done this already? That's where we need all this streamlined permitting, funding, informational support, because it is more expensive to build on many of these sites. It's just simply not the easiest approach to building a solar farm. As noted by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, when looking at abandoned mine lands, there are concerns about subsidence. There are huge cleanup costs. And so a solar developer looking at an abandoned mine land versus an open farm field says, I'm going for the farm field. It's cheaper and easier. So we're trying to provide ways to make these sites more feasible and palatable to developers.
How does the recent kind of surprise uptick in energy demand from AI influence this? Has it made it easier because more people want more energy more quickly, or has it kind of put everybody on a standstill waiting for what's going to happen next?
Okay, now I don't need to repeat the question because he had the box, right? All right, good. Excellent question. So I think we don't know yet, right? There's a lot about the AI data center crypto demand that we don't know. First of all, is it gonna pan out to be as big of an increase as we think? There's been other times in recent history where we thought there was gonna be a huge increase in electricity demand, like when we all started using personal computers and iPhones and all of that. And then because of energy efficiency and other sorts of things, it just didn't pan out that way. So I mean, demand for the last 10 years, as many of you know, has been flat, not something we've had to worry about. Now, just really as of last year, it's like, oh, no, 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 now it's going to go up. So, but now we've got like big players, right? Like seriously big players like, you know, Microsoft and Amazon who like, they're like, if we need to build our own power plants or start up a retired nuclear plant in Pennsylvania or do things like, we can do that. We've done other big things before. So like there's a potential that could jumpstart a ton of clean energy if those companies are really serious about their climate commitments and their decarbonization commitments, right? So it could lead to a lot more development, right? Because now there's going to be more money, there's going to be more expertise, and there's just going to be a lot more players. On the other hand, one option is the utilities say, oh, yeah, well, we were going to go close all those coal plants, but now we got to keep them all open, right? And by the way, we want to build 10 new gas plants here and 10 new gas plants there because we need to keep up with that demand. And so then the question is, it's mostly going to be state regulators. Are state regulators going to let them do that? So it has the potential to move us in the opposite direction because, in large part because of this energy density problem. You don't need as much land certainly for a nuclear plant, but also for a gas plant as you do for wind and solar. And if you want to build quickly, right now, a lot of the impediments that Hannah and I talk about in the paper, those impediments are, I would say, worse for wind and solar than for other energy resources. So part of it is I would say we don't really know. It has the potential to actually do a lot of good. And it also has the potential to set us back because, of course, all of these 100% clean energy scenarios by 2035, those scenarios were based on not needing to deal with a whole lot of new demand, right? I don't know. What are your thoughts, Hannah? And Seth, too. Agree on any of those? Anything that I'm sort of missing in terms of considerations?
I think, well, the only additional point would be they want base load too, right? So if they are building solar and wind, I think there'll be a lot more focus on batteries.
Right, right. So they're like, we need it 24/7. I mean, the other thing, though, is what kind of requirements or limits are either grid operators or regulators going to put on the new data centers, like in terms of having really strict energy efficiency requirements or saying, or requiring them to do what you usually don't require sort of new industrial loads to do. I mean, I think that's on the table as well. I think in Texas, they're basically saying, build your own. Like you can build lots of stuff here in Texas, have your own power plants. Like don't rely on the grid. We've never done that before, but I mean that some Texas regulators have said that. I mean, it may be that this moves us to sort of a new nuclear energy renaissance, right? Maybe not. I don't know. But there's a lot on the table. I actually think parts of it are kind of exciting, but parts of it are scary too. Because a lot of it is what are we going to build? What are we going to not close that we were anticipating closing? So that puts a lot of pressure on regulators and also utilities not to see this as an opportunity to build a whole bunch of new gas plants, getting a 12% rate of return on that and use that as an excuse, which has happened in the past. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Great talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
So one comment. Yeah, I just heard the other day that Microsoft is talking about starting up 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant.
They are indeed.
My jaw hit the floor. So we'll see how that goes. But my question is kind of relates to scale, spatial scale, and that. So I've done some work into abandoned cropland as a place where we might be able to do things like this. And it's real easy to get information and data at the aggregate national level and state level about how much ag was there in the past, how much is there today, and that difference is how much is there for something else. But it gets really useful at the local level, like you're saying, where are we going to do this? Where is that land at the local level? And something that I've struggled with is finding good data on that, like parcel level data, property data, ownership data. So from the legal perspective that you're coming from, I was just curious if you had really gotten into that aspect of this, is trying to get good data about ownership at that local level, about where these opportunities might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. So, I mean, the ownership is not as that difficult, but it's the other attributes of the land, like which ones are really important wildlife habitat that you don't want to mess with. What's the classification of the farmland there? Is it like marginal? Is it prime farmland? In terms of looking at, I mean, certainly there's the cropland piece of it, but then again with like landfills and mining areas, which ones are more appropriate. And I know, Hannah, you've worked with some of the groups around here in terms of, I mean, this is where that sort of information services, the mapping comes in. And there's been a lot of initiatives like out in Wyoming. I think there's a big one in Kentucky. I think also here in Pennsylvania. So that's happening. Yeah, I mean, on a general level, yeah, we got a lot of land. That's great, but you need to know where you can actually build. I think the ownership, though, is not too much of a problem, but I could be wrong about that. Here, why don't you grab the microphone?
Yeah, and I'm going to give the DEP all the credit. I'm only aware of what the DEP is doing. I'm working with them more on a solar issue, but yeah, we need more granular data. And I think the DEP is doing that for abandoned mine lands in Pennsylvania. They're trying to layer everything, right? So are there conflicting land uses on the mine land? What type of mine land is this? Was it abandoned before the federal statute required cleanup? So just providing as much granular data as possible. That's what we need. And that's what has been done for these limited types of sites. But to my knowledge, not so much for farmland. I wonder if the USDA soil maps could help, and the regional conservation offices, if we could get all that data together to be useful.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that in terms of, there's the federal level data, there's often state level data. I was thinking, because I was looking at some of the legal filings for this Xcel Energy big solar project that's on the Sherco site, the one where they're retiring the coal plant and building 800 megawatts of solar. So they're using, the footprint of the coal plant, but obviously that's not big enough for 800 megawatts of solar. So they're using neighboring farmland, and there was an appendix to one of the filing that showed the classifications of that land and which parts of the parcel fell into different different soil classifications. And so they were able, and part of what they're doing is a lot of pollinator habitat there as well. So basically the Public Utilities Commission was able to conclude that this is like a much better use of this particular part of the farmland because of the classification. Really wasn't being used to grow crops in recent years, and that it was really actually going to improve the land. And that was really important to them in granting the certificate of need and the permit for the project. So I think we're starting to do that on these like project by project basis. But of course, what you want is you want to have that data so that project developers can come and build their project, not doing it after the fact. And so that the community is aware of what the pros and cons are.
So this is a question that came in on Zoom. This piggybacks off an earlier one. So the question is, do you see smaller scale nuclear plants emerging as an alternative power supply solution in addition to wind and solar?
They're still working on them, right? There's a lot of federal money going to them. I'm optimistic. I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon. I mean, now that the Georgia plant is up and running, I think people are a little more bullish that we might actually start building conventional nuclear plants again in the U.S. Talked about opening 3 Mile Island. The one that's further along is there's the Palisades plant in Michigan that retired. I mean, it was shut down, and now they have federal money to reopen it. And it's being reopened like now. So that will probably be the first plant in the US that is getting reopened. They're not going to close Diablo Canyon in California, which was on the way to being retired. And now they have federal money to keep it open because California can't meet its decarbonization goals without nuclear. I think at least the current gubernatorial administration has decided that, and I think that's probably right. I think the problem with the smaller modular reactors is right now it's cost. I mean, that's the issue with all nuclear now, is like it's really, really expensive in the US because we haven't built them in a long time. Like they build a lot of them in France and a lot of them in other countries, but big projects that you haven't built in a while cost a lot, right? Everything is a bespoke project. So like wind and solar, we know how to build those. It's pretty cheap right now, right? We know how to build gas plants. In Europe, they know how to build offshore wind, but it's like incredibly expensive here. But nuclear is interesting because I sort of certainly learned this from my time at DOE, but you can also figure this out just by looking at where the money is going. Nuclear is one of those bipartisan energy resources. Democrats like it and Republicans like it, so they shower it with money. Carbon capture sequestration, kind of the same. So those are sort of energy and sort of carbon management goals that can be agreed on. And so is it the best place for the money to go? Hard to know until we see the results, right? We shower a lot of money on different types of technologies. Some work, some don't. SMRs might go into that category. I think it's hard to say right now just because we don't have any real successes on it in terms of them actually operating.
So I'll be quick. One comment and one question. On the comment side, I know a lot of attention is paid to land for obvious reasons. I was wondering for your next 110-page paper or for something for one of your students is to try to integrate across land, soil, and air and think about this broader dynamics of not just the land. There's all the externalities that go, below surface, above surface, at the surface. Then the other question I had was, like, I totally get the story about the billions and about all the money out there, but it seems like the groups that have the easiest access to this are nuclear power plants or developers or people with money. How does a local community actually get access to this money? It's probably not on their priorities. They might not be aware of it. Like, how do we build this sort of structure in place where people who are living in these communities have organization, have groups, have grassroots movements? Because I feel like that is kind of the missing thing to getting this thing started. But thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, your last question is great. So, DOE and the other agencies have been working really hard to do that. So, okay, we develop a grant program, right? And then there's a grant application process. And what you have to read is like 100 pages. And you're a small rural community that has no staff, they're going to apply. And so actually, that's one of the things that Secretary Granholm was really focused on, is how can we make these user-friendly? There's been a lot of work in the federal government to make it easier for communities to apply for these types of grants. I mean, DOE in the past, they worked with big universities like Penn State, and they work with very sophisticated parties to give out money, not like rural, local governments, right? So there's an effort to do that. I mean, they're nowhere near getting there, but there is definitely a focus on some of that money goes to developers, but then through these community benefit plans, which are required as part of the grants, some of that money is supposed to flow to communities. We'll see how that works. But really building that local capacity. And a lot of it is through nonprofits, right? And having nonprofits that can work with these groups. And EPA has worked with a lot of community groups in the past on sort of contaminated properties. And I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's like TICTACs is it's like technical assistance to communities. There's lots of acronyms. But those are like those third-party groups that are there to work with communities and sort of help them, because otherwise, every time you negotiate for a win, you have a negotiation between a community or landowners and a developer. It's its own thing, and then there's not cookie cutter, right? And at some point you want to make it more standardized. On the other hand, every community wants something a little bit different, so you can't have it too standardized. So that's the tension.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about similar things, because a while back I was looking at, I don't know if it's who it's through exactly, DEP or Department of it, but in Pennsylvania there was the study for abandoned former mine lands. How do you reclaim them for solar development? So there's this big study. And I think one of the things that came out of that was that also on these former mine lands, the parcels are quite small for like a utility scale development. So it was like, well, maybe this would be better for community solar, but we don't have community solar in Pennsylvania. So I don't know if I have a question, but just like thinking about like how do we address sort of that part of the issue as well as an open question to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, the scale is really important, but I mean, that's why I think once you build a few of these projects, more communities will actually want them if there's benefits to them, right? So like your point on community scale, you're right that some of the lands are going to be big enough for like, at least for a large scale solar. Some of them are not. But if enough people want them, well, then maybe that's going to provide enough support that you could get a community solar bill passed in the state. And so then you'd be able to use those lands for community solar. So, I mean, I think it's one of those things that once you build some projects, then those, and then you make sure that other communities know the benefits of those projects and really have a communication strategy, then I think that can build a lot of support. I mean, one of the things that distresses me is the only thing usually that you see in the paper are the projects that have failed or the projects that are tearing communities apart, like all the headlines that I put up. But there's like a lot of wind and solar projects out there, and there's a lot of projects that people are quite happy with, right? But we don't hear about those, right? We hear about the bad news. So if we can change that communication strategy, that can really build support for policy changes that can then address that scale issue.
Thank you very much, Alex. This was incredible. We're so glad to have you here from Michigan, and thanks everyone for coming. Have a wonderful evening.